We're gonna look on how much the US embargo on Cuba does really affect its economy. Indeed, many people on the internet claim that for Cuba it is just impossible to trade with any country in the world. Okay, but seriously, before starting, I'm gonna make some preliminary remarks. I'm not gonna talk about why the embargo should be lifted, I'm not gonna talk on why America is such an hypocrite nation, and so on. I definitely just want to share facts and data. The first question here is, what's happening in Cuba? Cuba has been grappling with acute shortages of food and medicine throughout the pandemic. People make lines for blocks to buy whatever they can find at stores. Inflations and blackouts during the tropical summer heat have aggravated the situation. In a speech, President Miguel Díaz-Canel said the US politics of economic asphyxiation was having a cumulative effect on Cuba. On the other hand, Pavel Vidal, a former Cuban central bank economist who teaches at Javeriana University in Cuba, said reforms in Cuba do not depend on the embargo, and the embargo should be eliminated unilaterally, independently from reforms in Cuba. Both cause problems. Although the two positions are not completely opposite, Vidal has a valid point. Even experts have many difficulties in calculating how much does the embargo affect Cuban economy and what would happen if reforms would be implemented in Cuba. So, who is right here? Back at history, the 80s were a period of little scarcity in Cuba, thanks to subsidies from the Soviet Union. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, subsidies dried up, and Cuba struggled with extreme deprivation and massive food shortages, its economy contracting by over 35%. Many economists say Cuba never really recovered.
Hello darkness, my old friend, I've come to talk with you again.
After the end of the Cold War and US victory,
America, fuck yeah, coming again to save the motherfucking day, yeah.
the embargo was instead tightened in 1992 with the implementation of the Cuban Democracy Act or Torricelli Act and the Helms-Burton Act or Libertad Act. What I want to do now is to examine these two acts and make a comparison with an official document of the EU called Extraterritorial Sanctions on Trade and Investment and European Responses, which is also about these two US measures, their impact in Europe and European commerce with Cuba. Of course, link in the description. The Torricelli Act of 1992. The act authorizes the President to apply sanctions against any country that does not cooperate and continues to trade with Cuba. In practicality, this means the power to sanction foreign subsidiaries of American multinational corporations, which continued to trade with Cuba. The justification for that act was not national security interests, but the Castro regime's form of government and human rights abuses. The impact of this tightening on both US and European firms was immediate. On the other hand, European firms which had no connections with US was likely advantaged, as they were able to pick up opportunities in Cuba that US and US-connected firms had abandoned. This was particularly evident in tourism, tobacco, and machinery sectors. The Helms-Burton Act of 1996. In 1996, Congress passed the Cuban Liberty and Democratic Solidarity (Libertad) Act, a bill that President Clinton had threatened to veto, but instead signed into law in the aftermath of the downing of two US civilian planes by Cuban fighter jets in international airspace. The Libertad Act allows US citizens whose property was expropriated by Castro's regime the right to sue in US courts foreign companies and citizens trafficking in their property. Title 3. The right, indeed, is problematic, because It essentially extended US jurisdictions to the results of events that occurred in foreign territory. This clause was highly contested by both EU and Canadian businesses, and governments of these respective entities filed complaints with both the World Trade Organization and North American Free Trade Act. However, Smith and Wagner-Brooks note that in 1997 the US agreed to suspend Title III of the Act relating to trafficking. In May 1998, the Clinton administration and the European Union reached an agreement that excludes citizens of the EU countries from Title III and IV of the Helms-Burton Act, in exchange for guarantees from the EU not to subsidize investments in expropriated properties. As with previous restrictions, European firms with no connections to the US were likely to benefit from both the removal of US competition in Cuba, as well as the higher prices which could be commanded due to the lack of competition. A report from the American Association for World Health in 1997 noted that Cuba spent an extra US dollars 8.7 million on health equipment imported from the EU as well as other areas from 1993 to 1996. But, despite this reality, overall exports to Cuba showed increases from EU member states over the decade of the 90s, alongside increases in imports. However, there were steep declines in exports surrounding the two pieces of legislation, leading to a plateau in exports and a consolidation before value started growing again. The aggregated nature of the data makes it difficult to say if volumes actually increased, if it was a shift towards fewer but higher value goods which were traded after the tightening of the embargo, or if there were exchange rate moves which almost totally account for the higher value of exports, likely as Cuba's peso underwent a massive devaluation from 1990 to 1993. At the same time, this aggregation of data might be capturing domestic reforms which were happening within Cuba from 1994 to 1997 to stave off economic collapse, as some limited liberal reforms, such as the creation of export processing zones, may have contributed to the increase in exports with the EU. In sum, however, the two acts appear to have increased the volatility of trade volumes, even if they did not have impressive dampening effects in the longer term on aggregated trade flows and may have been dominated by Cuban domestic policies. In 2000, an exception from the embargo approved by US Congress authorized the sale of food, agricultural products, medicines, and medical equipment to Cuba, provided Havana paid in advance and in cash. The US embargo indeed allows humanitarian goods to reach Cuba. This indeed corresponds with the two graphics showed before, in which, in 2000, signed a decline both in imports and exports from and to the EU. As we can see on the side of the OEC, link in the description below, via technology here, Cuba has a completely unfavorable trade balance, as the country totally relies on imports, which are here, and Cuba has an absolute need for dollars, but we will discuss that later. In fact, imports, again, are almost 5 times the exports, and the three major partners for Cuba are Spain, with more than $1 billion of trade. Here are the imports. China and Italy. For the United States here, the United States has a total value of export to Cuba of $279 billion US dollars. All my data and charts are indeed confirmed here in the TC Data 360 site. We can see how the imports of goods and services to Cuba just increased during all the 70s and all the 80s. Here we have the collapse of the Soviet Union, And here, in 1993, the imports of goods just reached their lowest point in history with $3.52 billion. Then the imports just slightly increased during the 90s, and from here, from 2002, as we can see, they just skyrocket to the 2008. As I said before, in the 2000, the embargo was slightly lifted, so this is the result. And then we have the Great Crisis here. But again, considering that I want to give you other perspectives, according to Pavel Vidal, the US embargo does have a negative impact on the economy, restricting imports and exports and make it riskier for investors to put money into Cuba. But at the same time, Cuba has not heeded the advice of China and Vietnam in adopting economic reforms. During an official visit in 2018, the General Secretary of Vietnam's Communist Party, Nguyen Phu Trong, urged Cuba to embrace a market economy, as Vietnam did in the 80s. During its period of rapid economic growth, 30 million Vietnamese were lifted out of poverty. Faced with severe shortages of food and medicine, Diaz-Canel recently picked up the pace of reforms, unifying the country's dual currency and legalizing the status of private businesses that began operating decades ago, promising more movement in that direction. Cuba also imports from the US itself. In a statement to NBC News, the State Department said it expedites any request to export humanitarian or medical supplies to Cuba. The US embargo allows the exports of agricultural products and food, medicine and medical equipment, and humanitarian goods to the island. In the first 6 months of 2021, for example, Cuba imported $123 million worth of chicken from the US, State Department spokesman Ned Price told reporters. Price also said that in 2020, the US exported more than $175 million worth of goods to Cuba, including food and medicine. Cuba entered the era of the pandemic with an already weakened economy. Former President Donald Trump travel restrictions had reduced tourism to the island, the second most lucrative source of revenue for the government. The aid Cuba relied on from Venezuela had also declined dramatically after the economic and political crisis. In 2017, the Trump administration prohibited commerce with businesses controlled by or operating on behalf of the Cuban military, intelligence agencies, and security services. Washington turned up its pressure on Havana in 2019 when it began allowing US nationals to sue entities that traffic in or benefit from property confiscated by the Cuban regime. Congress provided for this in the Helms-Burton Act, but past US presidents had routinely waived the provision. Trump also suspended private charter flights to Havana and barred US travelers from staying at hundreds of establishments linked to the Cuban government or Communist Party, as an effort to keep tourism dollars out of Cuban government coffers and also curbing the remittances. Cuba's strict measures during the pandemic were praised for having greatly limited the number of COVID-19 infections last year, but the success came at the expense of the economy. Cuba shut its borders for 8 months with absolutely no tourism, which made up 10% total of GDP. Cuban Americans desperately tried to send medicine to relatives through agencies, but it took months to arrive, adding to the frustration. After Cuba restricted flights from the US to avoid coronavirus infections, the measure has kept many Cuban Americans living in the US from visiting relatives who usually make trips loaded with food and medicine. Strict quarantines make it impossible for weekend trips by Cuban Americans to unload goods and buy mulas, couriers who would frequently hand-carry packages from Miami to Cuba. There are no data on the amount of remittances to Cuba. The island depends on imports for most of its consumption, and it has struggled to import enough food and medicine, because a loss in tourism is a loss in dollars. No dollars mean no imports, which are the thing Cuba is dependent on. All of that, compounded with inflation and blackouts that last up to 12 hours in the sweltering summer heat, have led people to take the streets in protests. There is no doubt that American sanctions have hurt Cuba's economy, meaning ordinary Cubans, and Cuba isn't a wealthy country, but as the above chart shows, Cuba has still managed to maintain fairly positive economic growth for most of the last 40 years. In conclusion, to make a summary, the embargo on Cuba have its economical effect. Although some difficulties, Cuba can still trade with pretty much the whole world, and its GDP shows its growth. Legal problems and shipment costs are to take into account, even though I don't think we can hold the poverty Cuba suffers completely accountable on just these two prohibitions. Instead, watching his trade balance, it emerged how Cuba does heavily depends on imports, which is the opposite thing an embargo would impose. There were some politics causes then, the Trump sanctions, which reduced remittances and the arrival of dollars to Cuba, and Cuba's strict measures on COVID, which completely annihilate tourism, remittances, and most of all dollar arrivals to the island, which are necessary for Cuba to his import share. The aim of the video was not to state it is his fault or it is their fault. I am not judge here. I gave you data and information to make you have a clearer picture on this one. So I thank you all for the attention and see you next time.